think there's a lot of doom and gloom and sort of hard to hear and sometimes sad to hear stories in our world today. We are definitely going to touch upon some of those in this program, but I don't want this program to be a sort of sad, oh boy, we can't do anything takeaway. You shouldn't leave this presentation feeling like you can't do anything to help. If you take nothing away from this presentation, leave knowing that there are several things we can all do to help, not only to support each other, but to help support our overall planet and world. And we're going to kind of talk about them together. But to talk about any of this, we need to first understand what biodiversity is. That's a pretty important place to start. Has anybody ever heard the term biodiversity before? Show of hands. Anyone at least a little familiar with it? Okay, that's awesome. That's good. That was about like a third of us, a fourth of us, maybe a little bit more. So some of us are at least somewhat familiar with the term biodiversity. If you've never heard anything about it, thankfully the word itself will tell you a fair amount about what it is. Bio quite literally meaning life, and diversity meaning a variety or range of different things. The definition therefore is literally the variety of life on Earth. Everything from the big charismatic animals that a lot of us normally think of when we think of life on Earth, lions, tigers, bears, you know the saying, I'm not going to say it. But of course, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about all of the other amazing types of life on Earth. There are numerous species of aquatic life, fish, reptiles, all sorts of invertebrates, and of course, some of my favorite are birds, avian life. And that's not even taking into account how much plant life we have on the planet. There are so many different species of plant on the planet, more than there are wildlife species on the planet. And of course, all plants, well, almost all plants, have some sort of fungi around them as well. We have tons of fungal life on our planet, some of it that we even eat and are very, very familiar with, like mushrooms. And we aren't even talking about the most numerous life on our planet when we're talking about all these things, which is microbial life. Microbial life far outnumbers any other living thing on our planet. If you were counting even just bacteria, you probably have more species than you have grains of sand. So we have a lot of life on planet Earth to discover, to learn about. There's a lot going on when we're looking at biodiversity and studying different types of biodiversity. Now, admittedly, that's pretty hard to study the whole planet all at once, so usually we try to pick one or two specific areas to study. And I would argue that many of us in our program today, watching this program today, you're already familiar with biodiversity in the way that people like me study biodiversity, because most of the times we sort of already know about it. We just call it a less sciencey name. We usually call it nature. Now, I try to make this argument for people because biodiversity, at least the way we think about it in scientific terms, is basically nature in its purest form. You can't have healthy, beautiful landscapes, fun wildlife, and all sorts of cool interactives, these cool things we can do, like recreating outdoors, without having thriving biodiversity. They go hand in hand. And many of us, hopefully all of us, have had some sort of interaction with nature and with wildlife, which always has me wondering, and this is, I think, a good place to start for why we should care about biodiversity. Does anyone have a favorite plant or animal they'd like to share? My friend laughed. A wolf? That's a great animal. I love that one. What about you, my friend? An elephant? That's an awesome one as well. Did you have one too? Ooh, an owl. I love it. We've got so many different animals. One last one. A dolphin. I like it. So we have some tropical animals. We have some flying animals. We have some animals from the water. Okay. These are all super cool animals. If you're curious about my favorite animal or plant, come ask me at the very end. I'm happy to tell you about them. Why am I even asking about favorite animals and plants when we're in the middle of a show about biodiversity? What does that have to do with biodiversity importance? Well, the answer is pretty simple, and it's that we care a lot about biodiversity, more than people realize sometimes, and that shows pretty much right away when I ask people what their favorite animal or plant is. It doesn't take that long to usually get one or two responses, sometimes more. more, nature is pretty critical to us as humans and human health. And I want to really use this lens of nature being critical to human health to drive home why biodiversity is important today. We are right in the middle of our year of being human at the Museum of Science. It's basically a year-long spotlight where we are talking about all things human being, what it takes to be a human, human health, human well-being, really just anything human. And a big part of being human is our overall health, our spiritual health, our social health, our physical health, and our mental health. And nature is a really critical part of that, whether we might not realize it, whether we realize it or not. It has a huge role. One of those ways this role has been studied is a very cool phenomenon, kind of a psychological phenomenon, called the human-animal bond. Human-animal bond is a mutually beneficial bond between us and wildlife. It's proven to have some pretty cool effects, and it is mutually beneficial, meaning that we get enjoyment out of being around animals, but they also get things around being around us. Maybe that's food, maybe they get shelter or protection. They get a lot of gain from being around us as well. Now, traditionally, the human-animal bond, the way we think about it in psychology, has admittedly mostly been studied with our pets, our furry and feathered friends and scaly friends that we choose to keep in our homes by choice. But more and more research is looking into how the human-animal bond extends to wildlife as well, and even just spending time out in nature. Can we see some of those physiological effects even just around maybe plants, for example? And the results from a lot of this recent research has been pretty astounding. They've seen not only comparable results to the same feelings we get around our pets, but also some of the same health and body wellness benefits as well. And it can be in many shapes and forms. It can be something as simple as bird watching, going out regularly to see what sort of birds you can see and recognize, to relationships that are a little bit more complex, like a wildlife rescuer saving an endangered animal and that fully grown adult animal, in this case a lion, still being friends with the person who rescued them. We build really complex bonds with wildlife and with nature, and it pays off because studies have shown that even as little as 2 hours, I'm going to repeat that one more time, 2 hours in the span of a week, so not a lengthy amount of time in the grand scheme of things, can have dramatic effects on our overall health and well-being. It can do everything from improving our sleep and helping us have better memory, to reducing stress and chronic illness. It can help us focus more. It can help us have improved confidence and self-esteem. It can even help people feel more confident and more connected to their community and help them practice empathy. Empathy doesn't necessarily feel like a skill we need to practice or build, but we do. It's something that we have to kind of train a lot like we train muscles. And if we aren't practicing empathy every single day, we can lose that skill over time. Wildlife is a really, really good area to study practicing empathy with, because if you say something to your dog and you say it in a way that is accidentally offensive, your dog's not going to care. Trust me. They are going to love you no matter what. That's the best part of dogs. So practice empathy on wildlife. It's a really safe and easy way to do it. And it has some dramatic benefits. Now that's one aspect of how wildlife and biodiversity might help us, but there are many more. I would argue that biodiversity has already done a lot to help medical science and sort of science in general over the past decades. If you've ever used something like aspirin, give me a thumbs up if you've ever used aspirin before. Nice, okay, that was a lot of us. You all have the willow tree to thank. Aspirin was first isolated from willow bark, something that indigenous communities have known for thousands and thousands of years, well before the Western world finally realized, hey, we could put this into a pill and make it even easier to use to help us feel better. And other plants have pretty amazing natural compounds as well. This plant that we're looking at is called rosy periwinkle. Rosy periwinkle has compounds that scientists are recently finding might help us treat and possibly even help create a cure for diseases like Hodgkin's lymphoma and leukemia. That's pretty incredible that a plant that we thought was only aesthetically beautiful could also help us potentially cure a once fatal cancer. That's amazing. And they're not the only plants that we're finding this from. There are several tropical plants that more and more recent research is finding could help us treat cancers, treat chronic illnesses, and treat diseases that we thought were uncurable. We're finding all sorts of new cures every single day, but a lot of those same plants that we're finding cures from are disappearing at an alarming rate. Really, there's arguably almost no human health without biodiversity. We need our healthy planet. We didn't even talk about in all these numerous examples how our planet makes all of the air that we breathe every single day, most of it coming from our world's forests and our world's oceans. And there's a lot of research that suggests that things like forests make us healthier and happier. We feel better when we're around trees. But we've got another big thing happening right now, another buzzword that I'm sure many of you have already heard a lot. One that I'm not even going to explain too deeply, human-induced climate change. The thing I will say about human-induced climate change is that it's a lot more than just global warming. It's definitely, we are seeing warming in some places, but we're also seeing extreme weather events. We're seeing increased drought. We're seeing food insecurity, and a lot of other kind of trickling effects that are indirectly caused by climate change. And biodiversity loss is one of those indirect effects. I wouldn't say that climate change is the cause of biodiversity loss. We've been seeing biodiversity loss before. We've been seeing a lot of the major impacts of climate change, but it's definitely not making it any better. So what do? There's so far a lot of doom and gloom that we've seen. I promised that this was going to be a show where we were not only talking about gloom and doom, but we were also talking about good things. How can we help? Because we've already heard and learned that trees and biodiversity and a lot of the things we really, really enjoy help keep us healthy and happy. So how do we help in return? There's this idea in sort of conservation work in general, something that I learned when I was first studying to be a conservation scientist, called Think Global, Act Local. And basically it's this idea that says, okay, why don't we look at a global solution, something that seems too impossible for an individual to do, and think about how we could do it either as individuals or in our community. Thinking global, acting local. So I wanted to have us look at a global picture, a global story of recent conservation success, and then we can kind of talk about how we might be doing similar things locally in the United States. And for our global example, I wanted to take us to Southeast Asia. This part of the world is one of the most biodiverse parts of the world in general, not only on terrestrial landscapes, but also in aquatic landscapes. You'll find a lot of the world's coral reefs on this area of the world, but you'll also find one of the, I think, arguably cooler and also most important ecosystems, which is coastal mangroves. Coastal mangroves are a really, really, really important environment, not only because they are built upon trees, and they cover a large section of the Southeast Asian coastline, but also because those trees are nestled in basically kind of semi-salty water. And so they act as a nursery for marine life as well. A lot of the fish that we eat as food, if you like things like lobster, different types of like big seafood like tunas, a lot of them get their homes as babies in mangrove forests. So a lot of the food we eat also likes to live here as well. It's a win-win, both for terrestrial wildlife and aquatic wildlife. Here's the problem. What was once a super beautiful, covered in mangroves landscape has decreased a lot since the 1980s. In fact, since the 1980s, we have seen the population of mangroves in this area of the world lost by about 1/3. So we've lost 1/3 of mangroves in this region of the world. And that's mostly because of things like overfishing, shrimp farming, and kind of turning coastal areas into tourist areas. But there are ways to have the quickly. It doesn't take very long for a tiny seedling like this to turn into all of the small shoots, roots, and eventually large trees that we're seeing here. Now the problem is, what we're not seeing as context for this picture is that all of these sort of shoots that would eventually turn into trees were lost. In this picture that we're seeing, they planted about 30,000 seedlings for mangroves, and they were all lost because of unexpected tidal flood. So what are we going to do? We need more mangrove trees. We need to keep the old ones that we have protected. The answer was something that should seem obvious, but hasn't often happened in conservation work. They turned to indigenous communities who have lived with mangroves for thousands of years, and they said, help, how do we protect these things? And with the help of these community leaders, and indigenous knowledge, they dramatically improved their mangrove restoration. Not only have they seen mangrove numbers start to repopulate and grow back, but they've also seen the seedlings start to hold on better. One of the biggest innovations that, again, seems really simple, but none of the previous restoration workers and project heads had thought about, was making a barrier that would keep out the tidal floods. They used the ideas of the indigenous community, the knowledge of the indigenous community, to create these bamboo barriers that would both keep out invasive species, protecting the native species that were in there, but also help guard the young mangrove seedlings from being over-flooded when there was huge tidal storms. So it's kind of a win-win. And they continue to use this strategy today to help restore mangroves in the area. Now, as promising as this is, and as really cool as this is, that we're seeing a critically important habitat come back to life in this part of the world, we have mangroves in the US. It's not like you can't find them anywhere else in the world. We actually have a pretty big amount of mangroves in the United States, in the Florida Everglades. Pretty much all of the southernmost tip of Florida is covered in mangroves. It's one of the highest numbers of mangroves in continental North America. And it hosts a number of really, really incredible animals. If you've never had a chance to see the Florida mangroves and the Florida Everglades, I absolutely recommend you plan a trip. It's a really, really cool, astounding environment. You can see some animals that we're all pretty used to and comfortable with seeing, bobcats, all sorts of fun fish, but you can also see some really cool endangered animals, including the roseate spoonbill, which is critically endangered, and the critically endangered Florida panther. Now, we have mountain lions, we have panthers other places, but the Florida panther is a little bit of a different, almost subgroup of panther, and they're really desperately trying to hold on, only surviving in the Florida Everglades, these Florida mangroves. But here's the thing, we've got some pretty recent news that has come up about the Florida mangroves, news that you may or may not have already heard before I'm even telling you about it now, and that's that unfortunately, even though we've had a lot of support for this area in the past, we're not seeing that quite as much right now. Because right now, in the middle of the Florida Everglades, Ron DeSantis and part of the Florida government is trying to build a migrant detention center. Not only that, but they're trying to build this migrant detention center on protected indigenous land. So they are taking away land from people who need it, and they are also potentially polluting the environment while doing it. Now, this administration has said that they've done a lot of research and looked into it, and they fully believe that this alligator Alcatraz, as they're calling it, will not have any negative environmental impacts. But so far, the environmental nonprofits that work in the area have already started to see some negative impacts, and they don't buy it. So they are speaking up, and in particular, one company, one nonprofit called the Friends of the Everglades, has decided that the easiest way to get them to stop is to sue the government. They are suing them for violating essentially the National Environmental Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, and they have a lot of grounds to do so because the Endangered Species Act hasn't changed since it was put into law, and the roseate spoonbill and that panther that we just talked about are both on the Endangered Species Protection Act. So by building on this land without taking their protection plans into basically heard Ron DeSantis and other legislators in the area say, we'll see you in court. So you can follow along in real time and see how it goes. And again, that all sounds doom and gloom, but there's a lot of ways we can help. Not only for our beautiful Everglades in the Florida Keys, but also here in New England. We might not have Everglades, but we do have a lot of terrestrial forests. And in the past 5 years, the Massachusetts government has really taken an eye and an understanding to, we need some of these forests and these trees back. And they have done a whole lot to try and help reforest and restore our environments. Namely, the Healy Driscoll administration has put $2.1 million in support of forest and wetland restoration. And while that might not seem like a lot, it's already going a really long way. Part of that involves $1.4 million going to urban restoration, adding trees into urban greater Boston areas. Not only are they adding these trees, but they've specifically done their research and looked at where can we add these trees in communities that need them most. In communities that are suffering from heat impacts the worst, that really need tree cover, that maybe even really need kind of urban food forests that act as a community bonding place and a source of sustainable food. So they are really doing their due diligence, and it is paying off. This is sort of the preliminary example that they use as a test before putting all of this funding into greater restoration work. It took about a year to restore this site in the Upper Childs River area of Falmouth, but in that year and with a little bit of hard work, they were able to take it from pretty barren to really beautiful. And they've seen the wildlife bounce back as well. And there's lots of ways that we as individuals can help. You can, of course, donate to and be a part of any of these nonprofits that you see up above. A lot of them will take donations as small as even pennies can help. You can also volunteer for many of these nonprofits, or even in one day, smaller volunteer positions, like an annual trash cleanup or helping replant some of those trees that we're seeing around greater Boston. And of course, one that I always advocate for is taking action. If you see something and it makes you upset or uncomfortable, say something about it. Even if you're just telling a friend about it and talking about how can we help, studies have shown that by talking about problems with community members in a way that seems optimistic and positive actually does make us feel better about it and feel like we can help more. That's something that you're already sort of doing today by being here and listening to me ramble on about biodiversity. So thank you all so much for doing that. That's a whole lot that I've given you all at once. I want to leave you with some more resources though, so you're not just sort of left wondering, what can I do, where do I go from here? The QR code will take you to a link tree that has a bunch of websites that we talked about today, ways you can get involved, learn about your community, learn more in general. There are also some suggestions for things you can read and watch. One being one of our Army films that I would highly recommend. I think it's a pretty fun one. I'm a little biased. And you can, of course, also come talk to me. I'm happy to stick around and try and answer as many questions as I possibly can. You're also welcome to come see any of the fun things I have on stage with me. Otherwise, I want to thank you all so much for being here and for dedicating part of your time today to learning a little bit more about how we can help the planet. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.